Hi, I'm Joanne Fastoff, and welcome to How to Write Stuff Better. So today we're going to talk about planning your book, okay? Number one is the outline. Now, when we talk about an outline, we talk about, the premise and I want to make sure that you know what a manuscript premise is. So do you know the definition of a premise? What the book is about? Duh. Okay. Now, in my book, The Standing People, the premise concerns the illegal logging of precious timber, rosewood and ebony. And this is out of Madagascar, and also human trafficking out of China. Now, that's the premise. So when we talk about the premise is the book's central theme and why you want to tell the story. Once you've got a general idea of the kind of book you want to write, you need to ask yourself these questions. Number one, are you the best person to write your book? Well, I felt I was the best person to write about illegal logging because I'm an environmental activist and I don't want to see trees destroyed just for somebody's pleasure. And also, I'm not too fond of young women and men being sold and distributed like they mean nothing. Number two, can you see yourself working many hours on writing your book? Well, you're going to have to if you're going to write a book. Number three, once you've finished your manuscript, is there a market for it? My book genre is fiction, mystery, and intrigue. After answering questions 1 and 2, you must know how your book begins. Mine begins with death. Then you need to know how your book ends. I recognize that I cannot stop illegal logging of tropical woods, and I can't stop human trafficking. But because I'm writing fiction, I can end somebody's story. See, that's a creative license in that. And again, you need to know how your book begins. You need to understand how that muddled middle will kill your juices because you must fill in the middle with conflicts, twists, or scenes you've already thought of in your initial little bubble brain. You want to sort out your characters because there are first, second, or third person views. The first person is the person with the point of view. The narrator is the second person, the person telling the story. And the third person can be limited. It's about him, her, or them. But also that third person can be omniscient, all-knowing. And that's usually the author, setting the book's tone. Then you sort out your characters, the plot, the tone of your novel, and your writing style. Is it a romance, science fiction, or is it intrigue? Is it a thriller? See, this is going to define your target readership. And one of the things I want to be quite adamant about is you have to know your characters in and out. If you don't know your characters, you don't want me as a reader to develop them, do you? See, you set the stage, you organize the scenes, you start the scenes, and you have to build those scenes. And all of these elements must be worked out in complete detail to produce a comprehensive and helpful plan for your novel. I usually write in 3 acts because I'm from a playwright background. So I like to introduce the W plot. Now in Act 1, I set up my character-led novel, prioritizing character development over the plot's planning, which means I'm trying to establish how others perceive my character. In Act 2, I'm working on that plot. You have to know who your characters are before you start outlining how they got to the point in life and how they think about their desires and their goals. Now, the main character or protagonist is the character that your novel is based around. And often it's the hero or the heroine. And that character generates the story's action and gains the reader's interest. And these characters faced with a conflict must resolve or come to terms with conflict. Act 2, Story A, enter the problem, or we call it the plot. Now, it would be best if you constructed the novel's spine, which means the critical plot points, the who, why, and how. The what, when, and where will come later, but who, why, and how are very important. These are dramatic questions posed in the problem. For example, the history and the setup of illegal logging of tropical hardwoods is the problem in The Standing People. But Act 2, Story B, is the subplot. I am very character heavy, sometimes to the point where they become complex. But we're reintroduced to all correct characters, which means nailing down your character's fundamental goal, the thing that is truly important to that character, or some internal goal they want to achieve. Now, I'm not going to tell you the rest of the story because then you won't read it. But go to JoanneFastoff.com. Check me out, okay? Now, there needs to be an adversary of the hero or protagonist in the novel. You know, someone who is opposed to struggles against or competes with the main character. Then you have a supporting cast with power players or minor characters, and they do whatever you need them to do in the story. Enter Act 2, Story C. The bad guy closes in on the protagonist and puts them through the ringer. And this is where a backstory can become significant. A lot of times the adversary, the antagonist, the bad guy, in order for them to be believable, they need a backstory for the reader to empathize or sympathize with. And not necessarily to condone their action, but to understand who they are and why they are what they are. Nobody comes out of the womb horrible, except for maybe Dr. Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. Maybe he didn't have enough to eat as a kid. Ha ha ha. With many readers, they want to know, especially if you like the bad guy, that something about them that makes you love them, because the bad guy doesn't always have to be horrible. He can be horrible. If you think, oh, I kind of like that bad guy, then you want to know something about them to reinforce why you are empathetic or sympathetic to this character, and maybe even want to see the bad guy again. But remember, to make this person believable and credible, your good guy should have flaws. And they don't have to have a lot, but you have to remember to make them real and believable people. Act 3, you must end the tale. See, it would help if you tied up all the puzzle pieces, A, B, and C, so they come together to make the whole picture. And many parts of the puzzle are there, so the finale is that you tie up all the stories. Many stories have epilogues, meaning the strings of the story are tied up and offer a little of what happens afterwards. Now, I like to write an epilogue because, I write in 3 parts, like a play. I want to ensure that the bad guys go to prison, the good guys receive awards, and maybe a bad guy you love will return because you didn't dislike him. And perhaps the character goes to jail even though you liked them, and they had to go to jail, which is okay. Or maybe somebody you disliked was killed, and perhaps you even hated that person that died. But this serves a person in that some of us writers are not Hollywood ending people, but like to ensure that our readers don't leave so unhappy. Now, come up with a premise and make sure your story follows the premise. The hypothesis can be just about your main character, but still there has to be a subplot so that there's a bad guy, which makes the story even better. And make the protagonist just a little rung lower on the ladder that we place them. And don't make the reader say, oh my God, can this person do this? Now, when I wrote The Gordian Knot about a 10-year-old boy who had to get to Washington, D.C. to see my protagonist, Howard Watson, many people said, a 10-year-old boy can't do that? And I said, let's see. Scout Finch was critical in To Kill a Mockingbird. Mark Shea was essential in The Client. And what about 12-year-old Michael in the movie Fresh? And remember, Huckleberry Finn was all over the place. Maybe you were reading The Gordian Knot and said to yourself, I don't believe that person could do that. And perhaps because you can't. However, when you see some young people doing what you consider a significant adult thing, you have to say that's what courage is all about. So how do I interview a character? Well, since I have 7 books, soon to be 8, in my Howard Watson Intrigue series, I ensure that my protagonist stays the same way. He has the same kind of personality that he had in book 1 that he has in book 7. And the only difference is that he has witnessed more atrocious cases. Otherwise, he's the same person who attended West Point Academy and the FBI Academy and served in several wars. And because I'm character driven, I like to ensure that when I write the antagonist character, you don't hate that antagonist even though you might dislike that antagonist's point of view. I always want you to know that I'm from a social position. So when I mold my characters, they're not one or even two-dimensional. They are not flat. They have some life. How do I come up with a premise? Well, you have in your mind a story and you say, I'd like to write this story. I have an idea. The idea is the premise. And what is the story really about? That's the premise. Then you build on it. And where do you go with that premise? Okay, here's an example. A man drives his American car and the steering wheel comes off. What do you do next? Well, the story could be about the fault of American car making. That's a good start. That's how I would start my account, with a guy driving whose steering wheel comes off. He then crashes into a light post on the highway, and that's when your story takes off. You now have an idea. You build on it. What do you do if you have too many characters? Well, if you can remove one character from the story and the story doesn't change, you don't need that character in the story. Sometimes there are supporting characters, and then there are those who you just really don't need. So if you don't need them to do anything, you don't need them in the story. How many players on the volleyball team? 6. You don't need 7. 7 would be the supporting character. So if one player drops out in the volleyball game, you use that 7th person. You only need 9 players on the field in baseball. You only need 5 players in basketball. Get it? Now remember that I set my story up in 3 parts. Who? My characters. Why are they going to do what they're doing? What, when, and where did my scene and location occur in the story? Ultimately, I make sure that somebody goes to jail, somebody gets an award, somebody is a hero or heroine, and the bad guy is truly a bad guy. The premise has to emerge for the conclusion to take place. Otherwise, due to those subplots, it might get lost. But in the end, the premise is what comes through. In The Standing People, the story starts with death but ends with life. Thank you. Talk to you next time about point of view versus perspective.